This is the DRS train.
Well, it's finally happened. Charles Leclerc has won the Monaco Grand Prix, but at what cost? You're about to find out. I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by Ciaron Smith, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. Ciaron, recovered from yesterday yet?
Yes, just about. I was suffering from a strong case of boredom brought about by what was a lackluster Grand Prix, but at the same time, F1 always provides us with talking points. So excited to delve a little deeper into this seemingly monotonous Grand Prix.
Yeah, there's a lot to take away, despite how little happened on track, really. It was just quite disappointing in all aspects, because Monaco is something that we've come to expect not much to happen unless it rains or you get us a couple of. But this one, it just even less happened than you would have thought, because we had the red flag and everyone pitted. Almost nobody pitted after that, and it just became like, I was thinking, this isn't a race. This is just a lesson in tyre management. And it's like, okay, fair dues to the guys. Like, Leclerc did a full 78 laps on hards. George managed a full 78 laps on mediums, but that's not racing. Like, it just took that completely out of the window.
I completely agree, and it really isn't racing, because the teams are also tied in terms of what they can actually even affect and what they can actually implement with strategy. It's a shame, because had that red flag not happened, there were a few drivers like George Russell who had a contra strategy, and who knows, maybe they would have been able to leapfrog several places, maybe even fight for the win. And that was all taken away with the red flag, because then everybody was basically forced to take a pit stop. And now that they've made their mandated pit stop, there was no need for another pit stop. So there was no chance of the positions really switching or changing materially, which is basically why this race was the first race in F1 history where the drivers that qualified in the top 10 finished in the exact same order on race day. That's a shocking stat for me.
Yeah, and I mean, it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have this rule that in a red flag you're allowed to change tires and repair cars, and they have to try and determine a point at which they take the classification. And I mean, I covered this again in my manifesto last year. The rules around red flags, because it's different to a safety car, where a safety car does essentially kind of reset things. A red flag is meant to just suspend and pause things, and then you carry on as it was. And so it's, from my perspective, if you have a red flag, you're not allowed to change tires, and you're not allowed to do any repairs to the car. Like, I feel like maybe the only way you would be allowed to change tires, and this is the rule I put, was if you've got a puncture when the red flag is called, you can change the tires, but how about only the tire that has the puncture? Because otherwise you're on a brand new set of tires and everything else, and this way at least you've got still worn tires, one new one. It's a bit uneven, but otherwise, if you have to then pit as soon as the thing is restarted, that takes you out of the game completely, because everyone's still bunched up at the end of the day. But the repair rule is dumb, and the resetting of the order, because we've seen before with Hungary 2021, everyone was like taping the cars together with duct tape to get them to go again. The race before that, Silverstone, the red flag, Hamilton would have been out of the race as well if they weren't allowed to do repairs in the red flag. And the race classification, the running order is a funny one, because this is like, oh, let's just take it from the start, and it's like, well, no, Sainz has got, I guess, out of jail free card because he hit Piastri at the start, and then he ends up giving himself a puncture and ends up at the back. And it's like, they have this determined point of the first like timing marker that everyone passes through, and this is still the first lap, and it's like, maybe just take the order as it is when the red flag is called, because you've got transponders, we all know what it is, and also after the red flag you're not supposed to overtake. So why can't you just do it that way? Because everyone lines up in that order on the grid anyway.
Really agree again. It's an odd rule. Remember in Australia last year, Alonso had a mess of a restart at the end, but he knew the rules because there was a red flag. And so somehow, after his car had been completely damaged, he was reinstated in his original position. And I don't really understand why it's not the positions that are current at the moment that the red flag is dropped. I don't understand why we have to go back further than that. It doesn't seem logical to me. It doesn't seem fair. Sainz is a good example. Sainz made a driving error at the first start, and he paid the price, but then he didn't pay the price in the end, because the rule mandated that, he gets his starting spot back almost as if he had never made a mistake in the first place. So yeah, something needs to happen. on that front. That's not good enough. It's not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, with the circumstances of this race, had he been forced to start from the back on the restart, it wouldn't have changed much in terms of outcome other than everyone else in the top 10 moves up one spot. They would have all been unchanged. Yes, he would have been in a faster car, but he probably would have passed the Saubers and Logan Sargent, and maybe that's about it in this heroic charge through, because it seems the cars just can't. The cars just can't facilitate that anymore, and that was what was destroying any element of racing. Is that as well as it already being difficult to pass anyone, it seemed like everyone was just too scared to try it or to try strategies that might help with that. And it was exposing a lot that's wrong with modern Formula One.
Yeah, because what you're saying, in fact, was clearly seen with McLaren. I mean, they were tied, their hands were tied behind their back. They made their pit stop, but they were just content to kind of sit there behind the Ferraris, where I think a lot of people remarked that they had the gap to pit Norris. They come out in front of Russell and maybe put Sainz under some pressure. But they still didn't seem to care enough to do that. It's almost like, they're fine getting the publicity and getting a result in the race. So, that was totally unacceptable for me. And yeah, Formula One needs to find a way where we have races that are difficult to overtake, but then there's tons of strategic options and tires and other variables available to the teams to, in effect, make the race more unpredictable. This was a classic case of one of the most predictable races I've ever seen. So it's not something I think that's good for motorsport.
Yeah, I mean, with the top four, whether they would or wouldn't pit was basically dependent on George, because at the beginning of the race, because he had to save more because he was on mediums and they were on hards, he was falling behind a lot and creating quite a big gap. And he was even complaining himself that, well, if I go any slower, I'm creating a pit stop gap for the guys at the front. And of course, this race engineer very depressingly said, going faster is not advantageous to us at the moment, which is an amazing statement for a race. But then when they realized, oh, we've made a pit stop gap, then he closed back up again. And then it's like, okay, now the top four are not going to pit. So that took away that element for it. And they realized they could just hold it out. And then he ended up finishing not that far behind at the end. It was just so much obsession with maintaining track position instead of even attempting to be risky and trying to go for moves. And the only team that did attempt that was Sauber. And the only overtakes we saw happened at the very back. Because I think across the race, the driver that made the most on-track overtakes was Bottas, and he made 3. Because at the safety car, at the red flag restart, he passed Sargent, and then he pitted and he passed Joe, and then Sargent again. And Sargent passed Joe while they were being lapped, and that was it. Basically, it for on-track overtakes. Nothing else happened.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not really good enough. I mean, there were some clear chances I think that were missed. I mean, McLaren being case in point. But I think they'll eventually catch up. Whether it'll be in a year, I don't know. But it can't go on like this. And Hulkenberg is driving well, at least for the Haas team, because the problem is like, these teams, they're so limited now with what they can do on the track, but then these races mean so much to some of these teams. So like the Haas, Kick, Williams, they still have to race hard. They still have to really go for it in a race situation. They can't afford to sit behind, because even finishing ahead of someone out of the points could be a tiebreaker. So, I mean, this kind of segues into, the race and the fact that, we saw an opening lap that was just a shameful display of driving standards between Sergio Perez and Kevin Magnussen, but I think particularly by Kevin Magnussen. I'd also like to just take a moment to say that, there was a photographer that was injured during that incident, and I express my condolences for that. But just to quickly summarize what I'm saying here, I thought that first lap incident was totally avoidable. Obviously, it ruined the race after, but it ruined Sergio Perez's car. There was almost nothing left of it. So, shocking first lap, shocking driving by Magnussen. I think he should have backed out of that. And I'd be interested to see what comes of that in terms of Magnussen's future, and also if there is going to be any further action taken against him. It looks like there isn't, but I think honestly his move merited a race ban, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm amazed that he avoided any kind of penalty for that, considering that Ocon got one for his collision with Gasly on the first lap, which was far less destructive. and only involved taking himself out rather than 3 drivers, including his teammate. Yeah, it was. You're surprised you rarely see accidents that big at Monaco because it's such a slow circuit. But that run up after Saint Devoux is one of the faster parts of the track. But it's like, why would you try and make a move there where you can? And this is what Checo said: is that you can see and we know the track gets narrower, and also Hulkenberg was on his left. Maybe Magnussen couldn't have seen that. So it was, yeah, it's just funny because we got another red flag. I think now we're up to 22 red flags in the 2010s, so we've outranked any other decade already, and we're less than halfway through. 3 of the last 7 red flags have been triggered by Magnussen, which is quite an impressive.
Wow.
But also, it's an accident that didn't need to happen because all 3 cars were out of position. Because the race of these days, the race doesn't deliver. Qualifying usually does at Monaco. But the Haas's both got disqualified for having illegal rear wings or something, and sent to the back. And I was thinking, okay, all I was thinking was, okay, well, if you're going to make an illegal car, at least make it fast, rather than just both getting knocked out in Q2 or what it was, or whatever it was. But Checo got himself knocked out in Q1, so he never should have been that far back anyway. And this is something that people picked up on, is that this Red Bull is obviously not quite as good as last year's Red Bull. Both of them seem to share the similar problem of suffering in low-speed corners. And so with this one, Max qualified 6th, but then Checo got on Q1. And that seems to be the difference between the both of them when their car is not the fastest, is Max is still at the front, but then Checo just plummets straight to the back. So he never should have been there anyway. So it was an accident that, as well as not needing to happen, just shouldn't have happened.
You can only lose the race in the first corner. You can never win it, as a famous commentator always says. And yeah, Perez's underperformance ultimately put him in that position that he shouldn't have been in, because it's not maybe as quick as it was last year, but it shouldn't be out of Q3. Like, it should make it to Q3 every time. So yeah, Red Bull have some work to do with their updates, which I think they are well aware of, but one of their drivers has shameful driving standards at the moment. Not just the fact that his overtakes are tamer, his speed relative to his teammate is not good enough, making mistakes. I get why Sergio Perez is under pressure, so he has no excuse anymore when it comes to experience. This is his level. It's unfortunate that people don't see that. What I wanted to kind of talk about quickly was basically the fact that this entire let's say restart, it really did show the fact that tire management on this track was kind of the defining factor. And it bothers me to no end, because if there was one driver that managed his tires unbelievably well, it was George Russell. But I have a feeling that the fact that he managed to take his mediums to the end, and he had a lap time only 1/10 slower than Leclerc in the fastest lap board, I have a feeling if that red flag hadn't been dropped, George Russell might have been on the podium. And he drove a really good race. And something that's being lost in all of this was the fact that George Russell probably drove his best race of the year by far in this race. Before I touch on Alpine, Peter, what do you think about that? Because I think Russell's just gone under the radar. No one's really speaking about him. He drove a mega race, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed that he made the mediums last that long, because Leclerc was on new hards and he made it last, but I think Piastri was on used hards and his lasted. But then he was on mediums and made them, and only finished about 10 seconds behind. So I mean, Monaco is always low tire wear because it's such a slow circuit. It really doesn't put much of a load into the tires. I mean, the Piscine complex is the only fast part of the circuit, and that's over in a flash. So tire wear is really not such an issue. There is an issue instead because it's full of low speed corners that you have to be grip on corner exit and marbles and that sort of thing. But again, before the red flag, because he was on the alternate strategy, there's every reason to believe that he could have made that work, and found gaps somewhere, because he never pitted, but behind him the whole race he had Max and Lewis behind him, and they would create gaps. That what I found very funny though was that Lewis pitted, And then a lap later, Max pitted and still came out in front. And Lewis was just like, I didn't know the undercut was important. Why didn't you tell me? It's like, is this your first time doing an undercut? Do you not understand how they work? Surely you would have known more than anyone else that when you pit and you're in free air, you can go literally 5 seconds faster. And he didn't do that. It's like, what? How did you not take advantage of that? I was fully expecting him to pass him, and I was like, it's like maybe that was just a brain fart from him, or maybe this again was that everyone's being locked in this mentality of we must save time, that he didn't take advantage, even if it meant only gaining one position. It's like, why didn't do you not remember 2016, for example, how you got that lead barely from Ricardo? Like it's just madness.
Yeah, I think Lewis has been a bit of I think he just doesn't feel like when you look at his interviews right now, he's like making little hints that the team is favoring George. And I think he feels a little bit insecure now because the team is focusing on George rather than him for the first time. So he's bound to have some comments like that. I think Lewis just wasn't quick enough, and Max jumped him. Like Max did a better job, but yeah, Lewis's radio master saying like, "Why didn't you tell him to push on the outlap?" I mean, yeah, there's no excuse for that, Lewis. You know, that's on you, mate. And anyways, at least he took I respect Lewis and Max for trying something different and really going for it. I wish McLaren had done that. So I give him credit for that. I just give George Russell the most credit. I thought he drove a race equal to that of Charles Leclerc. He drove a blinder of a race, and that's what Mercedes need going forward from him. You know,
yeah,
bounce back to George.
Because even Max did catch him very quickly, but even on his new tires, he still couldn't get past him. I don't know how many. I don't know if it was a case that after 3 laps the tires were gone and he couldn't, or if there's no room anywhere. But yeah, he did everything he needed to do. It was just annoying to see people thinking only of maintaining position and not even attempting to gain positions. Because in the first few laps, Piastri, he tried 1 or 2 places on Charles and then quickly gave up. And by the end of the race, he'd fallen back. Maybe Leclerc had managed his tires better. Again, Leclerc was on new hards, he was on used. But then one that really stunned me was Tsunoda. He got lapped by Hamilton, who was the car ahead of him. His pace was just he was, I don't know how to describe it, like that, just abominably slow to maintain that 8th place, but managed to keep Albon and Gasly behind him the entire race. And then on top of that, Alonso was then creating a gap for Stroll. So even with Tsunoda going that slow, there was still another gap to the people at the very back. And we were over an hour in, and there was still 35 laps to go. And I was like, this is going to end. And I was trying to think, are we going to break the record for slowest average speed at Monaco? And I was like, no, to be honest, they were still obviously much slower in the fifth. So slow.
Do you remember in the end of 2021, they said the 2022 rules would equalize the field and bring everything together? I mean, you're right. There were like 3 different like categories of racing going on. Tsunoda was so far behind those top 7 drivers. Aston, yeah, Alonso had his team duties to play, but Aston had a quick car this weekend. I just think Aston didn't maximize qualifying, and thus we're starting backwards the entire time. So Aston, yeah, you can't ask much more from Alonso in the race. He did what he could given his frankly average weekend up to that point. But Stroll again made a really critical mistake. He hit the wall after he pitted and basically made that gap meaningless. And you know, they can't afford to have somebody like that in the team. You know, even if the father owns it, like it's just sad to see that because it just ruined everyone's strategy. So I don't have much hope for Alpine either, because you know, Lance Stroll is one thing. He hit the wall, but Alpine hit each other, and that's totally unacceptable at this level of racing. So I was not impressed by a lot of drivers, even though this race was supposed to be monotonous. There were some pretty bad performances down the grid, but then there were some good performances too. So, yeah. One thing I want to quickly touch on is Yuki Tsunoda. In terms of how he's matured this season, the past 3 races he's been mega. So what do we think here? I mean, do we think this guy has like finally turned the corner? What do you think about that, Peter? Is Tsunoda now like ascending, augmenting his abilities to become, a true top driver, or is there still a ways to go? Is the jury still out? What do you think?
I think he's getting there. He's helped by the fact that Ricardo is just continuing to falter, and he's massively outperforming him. I think there are still issues. We haven't seen any big collisions yet, like we did. Like everyone keeps talking about Mexico last year, and where he knocked himself out of 7th or whatever. And he still gets hot-headed. Everyone was complaining about what he did in Bahrain. It's like, to be honest, they shouldn't be issuing team orders in the first race of the season when points aren't even on the cards. Like, of course he's going to get annoyed about it. He really is he's getting into a groove. It's just a shame it's taken 4 years for that to happen. Latest rumors seem to be linking him with leaving Red Bull completely, which I partially don't blame him for, because he's been there that long and they seem to have no interest in promoting him. It limits his options of where else to go, because the main one people seem to be thinking about is Aston Martin, because they're taking on Honda units. That, I can assume, would only happen either if Lawrence finally gets rid of Lance and puts him in their hypercar team, or maybe Alonso just gets bored and quits because he's got that multi-year contract, which I probably won't want to see out if he can see the writing on the wall that Aston aren't going anywhere. Because at the moment, this is now they're now just a shell of where they were at this stage last year, when he could have won the race, for a slightly fumbled strategy. Tsunoda, though, maybe there is a window for him at Red Bull, because now Checo has had 2 races in a row where he's flopped, and based on his past 3 seasons, there's every reason to believe that's going to continue. And we're in a position now where he could genuinely cost them the constructors, because Ferrari are only 30 points behind, or 25 points behind Red Bull now, and McLaren are not far behind that either. And it's like, at this point, he is just becoming a liability because the car is less competitive. I don't think this year Max is able to just carry it all by himself. He will need some help from him, and I don't think he's going to get that. So maybe there is an opportunity for Tsunoda to go there, assuming they don't just hopefully don't give it to Ricardo, because we all know that Lawson has to go up to Alpha Minardi next year, with someone else there with him. So he's doing everything he needs to do. He puts in 100% every time and just gets hardly anything back. It's just, at least this time it was P8 instead of P10.
Yeah, he managed his race well. He didn't make a mistake that was super costly. Showed maturity, so he's improving for sure. And he again scored pretty much maximum of the car. Williams also did a good job. They brought it home right behind him. And ultimately, those are the guys that I think stood out in the midfield. Tsunoda and Albon really drove consistent races. It's just a shame, because I think the top midfield driver this year has been Hulkenberg, and he was knocked out of the race. But other than that, I think it was all fine. I had no issue with Fernando Alonso's tactics in the race, by the way, when he backed up the entire grid to help Stroll. That's totally fair game. It's just, that's a shame, because I think Alonso had a serious pace this weekend, and we couldn't ever really see it because of just where things played out. So I don't know. I mean, there was some bad driving, there was some good driving, there were some things that were boring, but in a way, that's part of the charm of Monaco. You just wish more people could try more things. Let me ask you a quick question, Peter. I want to just quickly rewind to Alpine, because Gasly got a point, but Gasly's generally being outperformed by Ocon. So do you think, that, first of all, what do you think about Alpines coming together in this race? And what do you think, do you think Ocon probably could have then scored points had that not have happened? Because I was amazed at how harsh team principal Bruno Famin's remarks were. I'm just curious to get your take on that.
Well, without that collision, the red flag still would have happened. Sainz would have still been given his place, so they would have just finished as they were. So I didn't. They wouldn't have had both of them score points. It would have been one or the other. I'll give him credit. At least he was trying, because like everyone else, he would have known, if I don't pass him now, I'll never pass him. You have to get it done on the first lap more than anyone. But people on Twitter were saying, like, oh, should they bench him maybe for Jack Doohan? I'm like, he's been beating Gasly all year. There's no reason for that. Everyone was shocked because Bruno Famin on Canal Plus was blaming him and saying this is blah blah blah. And it's like, well, I guess I appreciate his honesty. They would be that forward. And some people are saying that Famin doesn't like him because he still has links to Mercedes. And it's like, oh yeah, Mercedes are definitely your main competitors at this point, and his loyalty, or I don't know. But he's been the one doing better generally. It's just that it didn't quite come together in qualifying. It didn't quite come together because it was Gasly that made it to Q3. But then Gasly, his Q2 lap, I think he could have started 7th or 8th with that, but because he hit the wall at the last corner, he just ended up 10th.
Yeah.
But either way, the improvement there has been. It's not on the level of McLaren last year, but Alpine have made a significant improvement in these first 8 races when you consider that they were on the back row in Bahrain by quite some margin. And again, possibly in Australia or wherever the second race, Jeddah. They've improved significantly, and they're now sort of hovering 6th, 7th fastest. They're sort of they're definitely ahead of Sauber, definitely ahead of Williams, kind of on par with Haas and RB on a good day. Not really on Aston Martin, although Aston have flopped big time in the past 2 races. But yeah, I don't think he's getting benched for not definitely not for Jack Doohan again, because we're in. People might say, oh well, that Jack, he was like the day before the race, they flew him back to Enstone to do some sim work, and then he came back to Monaco, and it's like, yeah, he's a dedicated hard worker. But you're gonna anyone who gets replaced mid-season with these cars and with the stage they're at, it's gonna take them half the season just to catch up on pace at this point, and so Doohan's not going to be that good. It's the same if they dropped Logan Sargent for Antonelli or whoever else mid-season. They'll spend the rest of the season catching up to they're not going to unlock it straight away because they don't get hundreds of miles of testing a week, so they can't just jump in like oven ready for it. But because the top 10 didn't change, one or the other of them was going to get points, and maybe later in the race he would have tried something on, because these are guys that do tend to like that. Maybe they could have crashed and triggered another safety car, and that would have made things, I would say, more interesting, but I don't know how many people would have actually taken free pit stops because it was clumped together in groups of like 4 or 5 cars at a time, so they wouldn't have wanted to lose track position. But it would have done something to make
without question. Something that maybe they'll look at in the future. It's just so it's funny that we're talking about the strategic risk averseness of the teams. I think McLaren probably should have pitted probably Norris when we think about it. I had a conversation with Nav earlier where he said that Norris should have been the one maybe to pit, because then if he was quick, he could have passed Sainz. Piastri would have let him through to attack Max, and then Norris would have potentially given the position back had he not been able to make that pass. So, I wonder why the teams were so conservative today. Maybe it was because of that first lap crash. They just didn't want to risk it. But, this race will never be good if there isn't some kind of strategic variation by somebody. But overall, like I think the circuit itself is a great circuit. I enjoy watching cars go around there. Not sure that every driver after this weekend would agree, but like Daniel Ricciardo, but that's their problem. So, Peter, how good is Charles Leclerc? Like, what do you think? Like, this was an unbelievable performance all weekend. He was clearly the fastest guy, even though he got lucky in the race to an extent because the red flag came out early, so everyone had to stop once. What did you think about this performance? Did it change your view of him? Because he looked majestic all weekend, didn't he?
I mean, in the race, he did the same thing everyone else did, maintained his tyres and kept an extremely slow pace, which seems to be his MO. We've seen this a lot when he leads races from the front, is that he runs as slow as he can to save tyres and takes advantage of the fact that he's doing this at circuits where people can't pass him. Now, qualifying, okay, yes, so he took advantage of the fact that Red Bull were faltering. He got himself pole very narrowly. It could have gone, I mean, Piastri, his last lap didn't come together, but taken it. Yeah. So he did what he needed to do there. He didn't slip up in the race. I was waiting for something to happen, whether it be he hits the wall or engine dies, something. But from his perspective, he knew all I had to do was control this. It's just annoying the circumstances meant that he was able to get away with being so slow and just thinking, okay, just stick as I am, just go as slow as I can because I can hold the others up and I can make my tyres last to the end even more as well. By the final stint, he obviously had maintained them. I say final stint. It was in the closing stages of the race. Okay. He obviously had because, again, he was on Piastri on used tyres. Piastri is still getting into a rhythm when it comes to tyre management. He did then break out into a fairly comfortable lead. I just wish there was more to push him because it's, again, and I hinted at this in the introduction, it's like, okay, he's finally won the Monaco Grand Prix, but in the least like racy and competitive fashion you could. He won it by going as slow as is humanly possible while still maintaining the lead. And it's like, okay, it's done, but it's not a race anyone's going to remember, or at least not for the right reasons.
I agree with that. I don't think it was a classic race to say the least. And yeah, I think Leclerc is likely, looking at it from maybe a perspective of like, hey, look, I'm establishing myself at Ferrari. I'm the number one. He really should have had more competition, and there really should be more ways to take it to Leclerc. It can't just be, everybody has the same tires up left and same fuel loads and all of that. That's when you can beat something like that, when you can play around with more variables. But frankly speaking, like I think he is one of the best drivers in F1. I'm just not sure he's as good as Alonso, Hamilton, or Verstappen still. He's gonna have to do this regularly for me to put him above those. So, great driver, great race, but top 3 in F1, not a chance for me. That's just my view on it. So, moving away quickly then from just the race, Ferrari were quick, McLaren were quick. I think this is the norm, Peter. Don't you think? We've got a 3-way fight, I think, at every race coming up. Or am I jumping the gun there? What do you think?
I mean, okay, this race was a dud, but there are pointers to take from it because Red Bull was slow. Is that this season, it really didn't look good when Bahrain happened, but as it's gone on, it's gradually getting better and better because Red Bull are getting weaker and McLaren are getting stronger. And so now it is starting to close up. And I think Max is maybe sensing the threat because Leclerc is 31 points behind him now, which when you consider is actually a very small gap when you consider that Max has won 5 of the 8 races we've had so far, or 5 of the 8 races. Because one of those was a DNF. It's so I think he does need to start thinking a bit more because this time last year would have been just after Miami and Jeddah and Baku when he was now getting into his stride and pulling away. And McLaren, now it is getting closer. Maybe in the drivers he can still maintain a lead, an advantage, but in the constructors, it could so easily go to either Ferrari or McLaren at this point if Perez continues to just have his standard mid-season European leg slump. Everyone's just saying he's going to be useless again until Baku. So I'm optimistic that we've still got some good stuff to come. It's just annoying that this one ends up being a dud on a weekend that is quite a significant one for motorsport and is quite a busy one. Because I know that you don't really watch many racing series outside of Formula 1, but we had quite a hectic weekend because as well as Monaco, you've got the Indy 500, and then we had Formula 2 and Formula 3 at Monaco, and FRECA at Spa, and all of them delivered except F1, and like it's called the jewel in the crown, and along with the Indy 500, it's one of the 3 criteria for the Triple Crown of Motorsport. It's the one that's probably held in the highest regard, but you wouldn't think that when you look at it because, I mean, so FRECA at Spa, 2 great races, lots of action. There was a last corner lunge for the lead in the race. That was good. Formula 3, a few big accidents. It was quite. I missed the feature race because it was early in the morning, but there was quite a lot going on. It was unpredictable. Formula 2, it was the standard, one stop with some people on the alternate strategy making it work and others didn't. There were people messing up in places. Zach O'Sullivan got a very, very lucky win right at the very end from a virtual safety car that was timed to perfection. And with those ones, like overtaking is difficult at Monaco, but it can still be done if it has to be done. And then the Indy 500, it was just immense. I mean, it's the total opposite of Monaco in every possible way because you have the slowest circuit on the calendar. It's very narrow and very hard to overtake, and it's all about tire management. Indy 500, the average speed is like 210, 220 miles an hour, very wide. There are people are getting overtaken literally every single lap. Tires play very little of a factor in it. It's all about fuel management. That's really what matters. So in that sense, it is the complete opposite, and the spectacle was different. I mean, the race was so amazing, and the end was amazing. And you've got these grandstands of 300,000 people, and you could hear them screaming over the sounds of the cars. And Monaco just had absolutely none of that. It was a complete dud because we just got locked into this. Oh, we just have to save tires, and it's been like that. ever since Pirelli took over, every race has just been, how do we save the tires? I need to nurse my tires. I must preserve my tires. It's just, it has to change eventually.
That's why, it's, I think, more relevant than ever to advocate for a tire war refueling in races, so people can find offset strategies to each tire compound, and thus you'd have, more pit stops. So I don't know. It feels like F1 needs to tweak some things, because you can't have races like this. They're so unbelievably processional. Everyone knows what they're having, and there's no, justice court or court of law um, in that's preventing the FIA from doing this. What I'm trying to say is that, like, if they wanted to implement a tire war or refueling, they probably could. I don't know of any legal impediment, but something needs to change, because we cannot have races like that, especially when all these other series are now looking to kind of take back market share from F1. We can't afford a race like this. It just wasn't good enough. I mean, so predictable. And at the end of the day, Leclerc won. Yeah, McLaren could have done a better job, but everything was standard formation. Like I said in the beginning, top 10 qualifiers finished in the exact same positions that they qualified in. That's ridiculous. So overall, I'll finish this soliloquy by saying that I do believe that it should remain on the track. On the calendar. But I actually think the problem isn't the track. First, it's the size of these cars, but even more than the size of the car, I really think it is the fact that there's just no strategic variability allowed. Thus, we continue to see these monotone races at tracks that are difficult to pass, like Monaco. Yeah. It was a good advertisement in many ways for a broader rule set. What do you think of that?
Well, yeah, it was a very strong pitch, at least, to bring back refueling. Because people's argument, some people will say that the refueling races kind of flopped when we had them. And people point out that there were accidents in the pit lane sometimes. It's like, okay, in what, more than 10 years of refueling, we had maybe fewer than half a dozen like pit lane fires. And only one of those was a really, really big one, because Benetton had some dodgy illegal fuel line or something. But yeah, if we'd had refueling, that would have changed everything, because it's like, okay, the tire, we don't need to care about making the tires last anymore. Nobody knows. This is the problem we had when we last had refueling, is because you had to do Q3 on race fuel. I detested that rule, because it meant that in Q3 you can't actually push the car to its maximum, and then everyone is able to just work out what you're starting it on. If they brought it back and got rid of that, it would be amazing, because nobody would have they would know what tires you're on, but nobody would have a clue how much fuel you're running. So they wouldn't know until the first couple of laps. They'd start to suss out your pace and realize, but at the beginning they wouldn't know. And that today would have changed everything, because it would have meant the tires, it's not an issue, because the tire, how the fuel is. But I don't think there's anything wrong. I think there's nothing wrong with the circuit itself. I mean, the circuit in 100 years, it's changed very little compared to other circuits of that age. I mean, compared to like Silverstone, Monza, and Spa, it's really hardly changed at all. Because from the start line up to the Nouvelle Chicane is basically exactly the same. I mean, Saint-Devoux has been changed slightly. It's a tad slower than it used to be. Otherwise, the rest of it is exactly the same. The Nouvelle Chicane used to be Chicane du Port, which was like more of a kink. The Piscine complex, that's new. Originally, it was just a long curved straight, and then instead of Antoninos and Rascasse, you had a hairpin, the gasometer hairpin, and the start-finish straight was where the Piscine complex is now. So broadly speaking, the circuit is pretty much the same as it was. It's the cars that have changed beyond measure in that time and gotten so much bigger. There was an interesting video that I saw on Twitter of some footage of the 1979 race, and people were comparing that when the cars back then were actually wider than they are now, because this was the ground effect era when they had the Coke bottle side pods and were very boxy. But they had, I mean, the cars were definitely shorter, but overtakes maybe weren't as common as you think, but they still happened, and the action was great, and the cars were a bit more on the edge and a bit lairier, and they had less aero wake because they were less aerodynamically complex or whatever. Although this is a circuit where, funnily enough, the difficulty following, it's not so much to do with aerodynamics, because the circuit is so slow. It's to do with corner exit grip and just the general width of it. Is that it's so easy to park your car in the middle of the track and then not be room on either side to pass. So it's the cars that need to change, because the races, they've just got, as the cars have got bigger, the races have got progressively worse, and overtaking has got progressively harder.
Agreed. Yeah, I guess that points to the fact that your speed trap times don't really matter there in Monaco. Because it doesn't matter how quick you are in the corners, if the guy in front of you doesn't make a mistake, you're not going to pass him.
Yeah, DRS makes effectively no difference. And the one place it could make a difference is the one place they're not allowed to use it, which is in the tunnel. It's annoying because, yeah, as I mentioned before, F2 and F3, good races, because again, overtaking did happen because they're smaller cars, but also there were accidents because you have to factor in that these are less experienced drivers. So that's just the case. And it's 22 cars in Formula 2 and 30 cars in Formula E. Formula 3. Formula E, when they go here, the races always slap because those cars are tiny and have no aero, so they can do whatever they want. It's like NASCAR, but really slow. So Formula E, I hate to have to say it, but Formula E proves the circuit is not the problem, and you can have good races here. You just need to have the right type of car. And Formula One cars, they're not suited to this circuit. They're apparently not even suited to Imola anymore because we saw last week just how difficult everything was there. And that's a circuit which it's narrow, but it's so much faster and it's much more open than Monaco, and they still can't pass. There are too many circuits where we need to find a balance because every circuit, either overtaking is too hard or too easy, which is the case at places like Vegas or Baku, which are basically like F1's closest thing F1 has to oval circuits, where overtaking is just too easy. There needs to be a balance somewhere, and we just don't have it at the moment.
No, not at all. I totally agree. It's not the track, it's the cars, it's the rules as well, like you implied. And I don't really see what the holdup is from the FIA. It's just what annoys me. It's like we can all see what needs to be fixed, but just year after year doesn't seem to be addressed. Ultimately, going away from this Monaco, it was interesting to see Senna somewhat kind of also honored. Recently and just before the race, there were a bunch of Senna events, and he really was like a master of Monaco. I think he's one of the most Monaco Grand Prix of anyone. But I couldn't help but think of his quote: "If you no longer go for a gap, you're no longer a racing driver." I think Kevin went for that and listened to that, and we saw the outcome of that. So this weekend kind of reminded me that quote is a bit ridiculous and shouldn't really be, like, in my opinion, I don't think it should be like taken seriously. It's just something that I noticed this weekend.
It's funny, that quote, everyone throws it around and it's very misused, but also he was using that quote as justification for his collision with Prost at Japan in 1990, and this was before he then a year later said, oh, actually that crash was intentional, or whatever. But Senna, like, back in his day, he's won Monaco 6 times. It could have been a 7th had he not crashed out from the lead in 1988. And then Graham Hill, he was the original Mr. Monaco. He won at Monaco 5 times. Jim Clark never won here. Yeah, it definitely was one of a circuit he could really work at. And this was when Monaco, it will always provide a challenge, especially in cars of this size. I have no doubt that it still offers a huge challenge because it's just there's no room for error. But when Senna was doing it, this was a time when overtaking was very much possible. And we saw the amazing defense he put up against Mansell in 1992, who was in a much faster car and just couldn't do anything. This is a circuit where it's a measure of the man. I think if you can master Monaco, and that's the reason it's part of the Triple Crown of Motorsport, even if it's mostly for what you do on Saturday rather than Sunday. But yeah, we had the Senna Tubes. Most of it happened at Imola naturally, but the Senna stuff continued. McLaren had, would you believe, they had their another special one-off livery that looked less like a tribute to Senna and more like a tribute to Benetton, to be honest.
That's where I was going.
Yeah, I mean, one of the highlights of my tenure as an F1 creator, I ratioed McLaren on X because they put up another thing about showing off the overalls, and I just put that picture of the meme of that emaciated cow being milked again, and McLaren and Senna and people. I think I ratioed them by a factor of 4, so that's quite impressive. I ratioed Williams a couple of months back after they dropped Sargent from Australia. So I've got those 2. I think I'll try Alpine next, maybe, or Aston Martin, see if I can get them. We saw that Albon had a special helmet. Hulkenberg had a special helmet. It's like I just don't care anymore. It's happening to it's just a bit. They're not special anymore when it happens every single race. Special liveries, special helmets. That's something that used to happen once in a career, not like half a dozen times a year. It was just a bit. It was just a bit much.
I agree with you on that. I think with Britain, I remember being told in, like, what the equivalent would be 2nd or 3rd grade, that you have to say sir and thank you to the teachers. So, my point is that, anyways, with all this going on, bottom line, we need more strategic variability in Formula One right now. There's just nothing that excuses a race that was a one stop. Nobody could even try to do something differently. And all the teams just seemed scared to do anything because they were so desperate to hold on to the positions that they had. So something there needs to change. There's just no doubt about it. In any way we look at it, it's overdue. It's long overdue. Two quick points I want to address here. We mentioned we're jumping around a little bit, but we said how strong Yuki's been recently. And he's firmly put Ricardo to bed so far this season. If the rumors are that Perez wanted a 2-year extension with Red Bull. Red Bull have pushed back against that, and now Perez is probably going to get a 1-year extension. But if he doesn't sign that and they have to fill that seat, do you really think that Yuki would be picked over Ricardo, given Daniel had previously been teammates with Max? This is something I think about. Like, who would get that seat if Perez didn't? And again, quick tangent. Perez has been just garbage. He's been so poor. This weekend was another example of it. What do you think, Peter? Like, who would actually get that seat next to Max if Perez was not able to continue?
At this point, I would just desperately hope they tried Tsunoda because at the beginning of the season, first couple of races, it's like, okay, it's kind of there or thereabouts with him and Ricardo, but at this point, Ricardo has flopped so much compared to Tsunoda because his only points have come so far when he finished fourth in the sprint race in Miami, and then a few hours later he gets knocked out in Q1 in the actual qualifying. It's, oh yeah, great, nice job there. They can't at this point. They can't seriously be thinking of trying to bring him because it looks like even he's not even so much. And yes, he's a known quantity because they've had him there before, and he used to be their star driver. But that was until Max came along, and now you want to put him back with Max again. When he's going there, he's not going there to be Max's number 2. He's going there to try and redeem himself and reclaim what was once his, no doubt. And Tsunoda, okay, yes, he'll be cantankerous. There will be some accidents. But he's going to give it his all. He's going to push 100% every time. He's going to keep Max on his toes. I don't think he'll consistently beat him, but he will at least give him a measurable level of competition compared to Perez, who even when he's finishing second, he's not pushing Max. He's just finishing in formation because he's lucky that the car is faster. Yeah. And even when they have the few times last year when they were battling each other, Max would pass him on his first attempt as well. Whereas if Perez has a bad qualifying, it takes him an entire stint to gain like only a few positions. And we saw at Imola, he went off and lost 5 seconds, and that cost him probably about 40 laps of progress. It has to be that, because if we assume that at this point Liam Lawson has to be in an RB seat next year, because if he's not, if I was him, it's like, okay, screw this, I'm gone. I'm not waiting around any longer. I have to do something. I have to move on with my life and do something. And the same, I would apply that same to people like Dragovic as well, or Doohan. It's like, I'm not sitting here being a reserve for this long, knowing that there are people behind me in the queue that could just end up as well.
Yeah. Doohan actually got a lot of praise this weekend from Alpine. They claimed that Doohan was responsible for, really helping the drivers perfect their setup, kind of doing the Giovinazzi, as I call it, sitting in the simulator all night after free practice and after qualifying to make sure the drivers have a perfect setup and data on Saturday and Sunday. And Doohan was called out by Alpine as being sensational this weekend. And after Bruno Famin threatened Ocon basically and said there's going to be consequences, I wonder if Doohan could be the first guy to really to get a seat here, maybe even or like a temporary seat, even over Lawson, because Ocon is definitely under fire there. So that's one to watch for me. Is Doohan. I mean, he was literally mentioned by Alpine this weekend as being a huge part of the reason that they did a decent job in qualifying.
He gets mentioned in a similar fashion to Mick does or did at Mercedes. I can't actually still reserve. That again, because Toto with Mick was saying, oh, he's the one doing the setups and he's giving them tips on how to do it. And it's like, I don't think that Lewis Hamilton and George Russell need tips from Mick Schumacher on how to set their cars up. Like, I don't believe that. I mean, Alfa Romeo was saying this in the past that Tatiana Calderon, she's helping us to set. It's like no one's listening to Tatiana Calderon on how to set a Formula One car up. That's what I don't buy into it. But with doing, unless there's another major howler from, I don't think he's getting put into a seat mid-season. He's definitely a candidate for the following one because he is definitely one of the more proactive reserves, especially more than Drugovich. I think Pietro Fittipaldi is technically still a reserve for Haas, although now that he's racing in IndyCar, he's not at most of the races. I mean, he was in the 500 yesterday and got knocked out on the first lap, like literally the first corner. I feel like something that's helping him is that because the Alpine Academy is quite big, because in Formula 2 they've got Victor Martins and Kush Maini. And Kush last year was very consistent and surprised people. This year it's just not really landing. And Victor Martins, he stalled at the start of the feature racing, and he's really starting to flop. He was amazing in Formula Renault Eurocup and Formula 3, but just hasn't been in Formula 2. He's the next most senior Alpine reserve. And then the others are in Formula 3, so they're too far away. So that's helping him. He could definitely do so, but if he's not in a seat with them next year, I just give up and try somewhere else, because if they're going to make you wait that long, it's just not going to happen. And the same with Drugovich, because he would have to gamble on Stroll getting kicked out of Aston Martin, or possibly trying to put his foot in to replace Logan Sargent at Williams is another option, and then part ways with Aston Martin to happen. Mick, apparently Alpine are interested in, I think it's Alpine or Haas. Alpine are interested in Mick as well, because he drives for them in hypercar. And that's another one. It's like maybe we could see Gasly and Ocon gone next year. We end up with Mick Schumacher and Jack Doohan together. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it'll go that well, but it's like, thank you for actually bringing new drivers in and changing. One of them isn't new, but yeah, change your lineup, bring someone new in, give it a go. Why not?
I agree with that. I think that's fair. I don't think that the French element would be that big of a loss if they had no French drivers at Alpine in that specific example. But in principle, I think we saw a very stagnant grid from last year to this year. And that's, it's strange because we're used to seeing more changes. And, young drivers should be given a chance. I want to quickly just touch on the F2 references here, because I did see a little bit of the F2 race, and I saw a battle between Behrman and Antonelli that was absolutely mega. And I think that kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, Peter, that look, you can have great racing at Monaco. I mean, that was unbelievable racing, wasn't it? Between those two. And because the cars are way smaller, there was more confidence in the drivers to push without having save tires. So maybe we can touch a little bit on just in general the general F2 market and F2 grid, and what did you think about that, Peter? Because actually, I thought that was that battle between Behrman and Antonelli was incredible. In case in point, about great racing in Monaco with different cars.
I mean, those cars, I would wager, are probably similar dimensions to the V10 and V8 era Formula One cars. They're probably about the same size. And yeah, as I said, overtaking, it's still a challenge, but when you do it, it's very rewarding, rather than it just not being an option in a modern Formula One car. For the past, ever since I've only really been watching Formula 2 probably about 2019, 2020, and it's just been consistently best Formula One. It always delivers. But this year's Formula 2 grid is a very, very strong one. There aren't really as many obvious howlers and people that are just pay drivers that are just wasting space. There are a couple of people that's it really is time to just throw in the towel and not. But the ones people are really getting attention, one of them is Paul Aaron. So he used to be a Mercedes junior, and then he left them last year or the year before. Basically got usurped by Antonelli. He's a rookie, and he's now leading the championship, even though he hasn't won a race yet. So he's mega consistent. He would be an amazing fit for Williams. I think he would be a really good asset for them. He's one to look out for, definitely. Isaac Hadjar, he's a Red Bull junior. He is one. He yesterday would have been his third feature race win, but then he got screwed by the safety car, that virtual safety car, and was furious at the end. And he's had a lot of bad luck as well. He's always getting caught up in accidents that aren't his fault. but he for Red Bull, he's doing really well. He's probably the next kind of second in the hierarchy behind Liam Lawson. So there's potential to see him somewhere. Zane Maloney, things are starting to taper off, but he's had a really, really strong start. I can't remember. He's a Sauber junior, so maybe he could go to Sauber / Audi, but he'd be going there. Well, we know Hülkenberg's going there next year. It would obviously be in place of Joe or Bottas, whichever one, because if we assume that both of those has to go, that's an option. We might see him doing something because he again is being amazing, although it's been a little bit weak. Dennis Hauger, I don't know what to make of him because he's an ex-Red Bull and he just annihilated everyone in Formula 3, but hasn't really in Formula 2. Bortoletto, he's starting to get into a stride. He's the reigning Formula 3 champion. He's a McLaren junior. Unfortunately for McLaren, because they also took in last weekend in Formula 3, Martinius Stenshorn and Alex Dunn both got added to the McLaren Academy. But you've got that, and then you've got Bortoletto, and then people keep still talking about Pato O'Ward, bringing him in, or even Alex Palou and people like that. And I'm like, okay, we know that McLaren is locked in long term with Piastri and Norris because neither of them are going to want to go anywhere. They've got a really good rapport. The team, everything in that team is functioning really nicely. And yeah, Pato, a great driver. I mean, God, I was crushed yesterday when he lost that Indy 500 win at the penultimate corner, and you could see just how devastated he was. But he doesn't like a lot of the American drivers and the IndyCar drivers. He's not someone who's raced in European circuits that much. And IndyCar is a very different beast to Formula One. So even if they did suddenly bring him in a year or two, it's like, how do we know he'd be any good at it? We don't know. It's just that he should stick it out. He's doing everything he needs to at IndyCar. The others, I mean, yeah, Colapinto. O'Sullivan got a very lucky win. Colapinto, they're both Williams juniors. Maybe they could. The rest of them are just, yeah. There's a couple of other. Well, Ollie Behrman, of course, starting to get somewhere now. It's just kind of hilarious that he's the one that we know is basically guaranteed to see next, and he has at the moment zero chance of coming anywhere near taking the Formula 2 title. But as you mentioned, there was that amazing battle with Antonelli, where his experience, I think, showed over Kimi because he was able to literally outmaneuver him and get up because he made him take that very wide line around the Lowe's hairpin. And they're teammates, and so that was very high risk. And both of them are in a precarious position because Prema are used to dominating Formula 2, and they haven't adjusted well to these new. It's been very shaky. Kimi Antonelli, he's doing good, all things considered, considering that he's a rookie and that he skipped Formula 3 to actually doing extremely well, but he's clearly not the chosen one.
That's so fascinating because he's hyped quite a bit, and you're right. I mean, he has to perform in order to be promoted. You can't just promote someone based on hype alone. So, interesting to see that anyways. And, it shows what can be possible in the end. And yeah, there's some decent drivers in the pipeline now in F1. So, the grid's only going to get stronger, hopefully. But, my big takeaway is we can't have, we can avoid. The sport is smart enough to avoid races like this that are so one-dimensional and obvious. And it's a bad showing for F1 on the same day that there was quite a good Indy 500, as you said. So it's not nice when the F1 race is the more boring and one nobody particularly has any excitement watching compared to another series. But that's just how things are right now. But that doesn't mean we won't see some changes because I think Liberty Media know this wasn't good enough.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of introducing rules for just one race and not the other, but there is a strong case that people are saying that maybe everyone should be forced to run all three compounds in Monaco, because then that forces you to at least do a two-stop strategy. Because we had this interesting case, Qatar last year, they did implement mandatory pit stops or a maximum stint length because they were concerned about tires exploding. And it did make things kind of interesting because I guess we thought, oh well, we know at least there's going to be two stops, because this seems to be the default now. If they can, teams will always go for a one stop no matter what the circuit is. It's just this mentality of tire save. We must save tires all the time. They will never go anywhere near trying to go aggressive because they can't. There's no. It's not worth the risk anymore because these tires are not like the ones we used to have in the past, Bridgestones and Goodyears and other thing, where they will wear out eventually, but you can have a sustained period of running at high speed and they will hold out. With these ones, if you do that within a few laps, you've lost it, and you get only 1 or 2 chances to pass somebody, and the tires are gone. And that has to change, and that's what's really. It's what's really messing things up. It was like in 2011, it was a novelty because we'd gone from races where in 2010 people were essentially only pitting because they had to, not because they needed. And then in 2011, suddenly we're having 4-stop races, and it's like, okay, maybe we've got a bit extreme here. And now the tire life is better because we're seeing 1-stops, but it's only better because they're just not pushed. And it's like, why are people so scared of attempting an aggressive stop where you, I don't know, start on hards like everyone else, run shorter, then do mediums, and you run the whole time, and then you have a late race where you're on soft tires and low fuel, and you can just gun it, and everyone else is so busy saving tires they're not going to dare try and defend against you. Like, why do what? That's what Kobayashi used to do. It's Checo used to do as well. Like, why just more of that, please. But I don't want to make special cases for certain races, but I feel like we almost have to with Monaco if we're going to make it work with these cars the way they are, unless we see some big improvements in 2026. But I'm not holding my breath.
I agree with all of that. I think that definitely needs to happen, and it's long overdue. It's long overdue. So, hopefully the FIA realizes this and takes the correct measures, because little changes on F1 cars have huge ramifications, and I was never convinced of these rules, and I don't think F1's going in the right direction in 2026 either. I think Martin Brundle basically said that these hybrid cars and just how bulky they are was the worst mistake F1 ever made recently. And they're already like that, plus there's no refueling. It really does feel sometimes like it's a foregone conclusion. So we don't want that feeling ever again, and I'm pretty sure that most people think like that.
Yeah, that's how Formula One differs from basically every other racing series at the moment. It is. I mean, today, okay, this was an exception that Max didn't win, but we know he's going to win. He's going to win in Canada. He'll win at most other races. Whereas the other ones, Formula 2, anyone can win it. We got a very unexpected win again. Formula 3, anyone can win it. Formula E, anyone can win it. IndyCar was the same kind of deal. I mean, okay, we got Joseph Newgarden. He won again like he did last year, but you never really knew who was going to do it, because I don't claim to really understand oval racing properly, but because there's so much uncertainty and everyone is, I couldn't keep track of pit strategies because it's harder to work out, because when you pit you come out a lap down as well because the track's so short. It's a whole different beast, whereas now everyone is doing more or less the same thing, and it's like maybe we should give them access to all 5 tire compounds to use in a race, and that might or across the whole weekend, rather than because otherwise it does look a bit. I get how it made sense when we had double headers, that one weekend all the softest ones and the other weekend the hardest, otherwise nothing changes. But otherwise, why not just give them that freedom to use all 5 different tyre compounds? If the tyres are this way, we kind of have to, because we got away in the past of having just the prime and the option, but with these ones that doesn't work anymore. We very rarely see all 3 tyre compounds used in a race now, because the soft tyres have just become a qualifying tyre. And it still grates on me that at Monaco 2 years ago, because of the threat of rain, which did eventually come, but just the threat of it meant that we were deprived a race start involving all 5 tyre compounds, all 3 slicks and both wet compounds were being used by everyone. And we got deprived of that because of the threat of rain. The rain wasn't even there yet. That's just the whole, it's the whole caution thing. Like Zandvoort last year, it started raining and it's like all the pit walls, their brains fell out of their head and they just couldn't work out when to pit, when it was obvious that you needed to pit straight away. Because it's like, oh, the rain is light now. And it's like, yeah, but look at it's coming in. It's only going to get heavier. Yeah, I just really... there is a lot that needs to change. I get technical regs, that's locked in, especially engine regs. You need to give quite a lot of notice because it takes a long time. If we're going to go back to using V10s or V8s or whatever, that takes a long time development. But just in terms of actual just regulations, sporting regulations, those can be changed faster. There's nothing to say that next year they couldn't say, oh, well, Bridgestone or anyone else can come back and start having their own tyres, or the teams can choose their own supplier. They've got 6 months to build an F1 tyre still. Why not? That could be done. Things like that can be done quickly. Technical regs, that's a different story. But sporting, why not? Like, just try something different.
Long overdue. So let's hope some teams have the guts and character to do that, because F1 would be better off with something like that. So, I agree with that, and we'll see whether Liberty implements this the right way. Seems like ultimately things are going okay, but I've never also ironically seen a formula so detached from the one that I grew up watching. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's changed. You got to be informed. You always got to be on the pulse, and one thing I say is that rest the or the the people who wasn't called rest, but the people who make the rules in Formula One, um, they really need to have a group session after this race and think about some solutions. So,
or
that's
maybe listen to the fans more.
Yeah,
and read the room a bit more. Because even now, there's even less incentive to have hybrids because they're starting to suffer on the market as well. People are not buying hybrids so much, and it's like, and Vettel's race without trace campaign is really, really popular, and it's like there is every incentive at this point to just bring back V10s or V8s and have them running on synthetic fuels instead of, whereas what they're going to want to do is go electric. And that alone, even if the racing doesn't change much, the cars will sound 100 times better, and the engines. It's that's something that would be a start. At this period of, I haven't been a fan of the aesthetics of the cars since the hybrid era. The narrow body, the originals were fuck up. The wider ones, the 2017 ones, they did look fairly good. I think the combination of the shark fin with the very wide tires. That I'm now when these new ones came out in 22, everyone was the novelty of it, and everyone was like, especially the Ferrari, the smooth sweeping lines. But when you look at them now, they don't really look like Formula One cars to me. It's a very odd shape for an F1 car to have, with these very, very big front wings that are very simplified, and then these really, really weird looking rear wings. It just doesn't feel right, and they're enormous and so wide as well. It's just not. You can see how cumbersome the cars are, especially at Monaco, because even if they're as fast, if not faster than the V10s always looked faster because they were so nimble.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. So these cars look bulky and clumsy navigating the hairpin more than the V10s, that's for sure. And F1 has been, the F1 YouTube channel has been posting like classic F1 races, and you just take a few minutes to look at Monaco 2004, and you just see a better product. Better liveries, better sound. I think better racing. I'd argue better drivers, but that one's debatable. But F1 had something back in the day. So the positive news is maybe you can just copy what it had before as a starting point, and then we can build from there. But ultimately, something has to happen. I'm curious, Peter. We know this race was monotonous, but who were your top three drivers, or who was your top driver? Like, who left you impressed on the F1 grid after this race that you thought, like, wow, he managed this well?
I suppose if you factor in qualifying, well, obviously Leclerc got pole and led, and he's finally cracked the code, broken the ice, so he's up there. Again, Russell, 78 laps on mediums. I would almost say Bottas, because he actually made 3 overtakes, which was more than anyone else. So I'll give him that. At least they tried something, and he had a 2.5 second pit stop, which is not bad going. But other than that, the others didn't. There's very little that stands out. They either crashed, hit the wall, or just did what everyone else was exactly the same as everyone else.
I agree with you. I think Verstappen and Russell were the standouts. You could maybe put Tsunoda and Bottas below them as well. So, certain drivers really did step up, but we'll see where this goes in the next races. I predict the field will be closer, but Red Bull will likely have an advantage. Anyways, so really counting on Ferrari and McLaren taking this fight to Red Bull, so we get a 3-way fight for the title in the second half of this season. And then we'd have a classic season, no doubt. So the ingredients are there. Just hope F1 can use enough common sense to make sure that they exploit their own potential to the.
Yeah, I mean, we've got several much better circuits coming up that are very different to Monaco as we get in. I mean, we're now in the European leg, which is usually 2 weeks Canada, very different to Monaco. Long straights, low downforce, very much a straight line speed circuit. So I would expect. I'd expect Red Bull to be on top there again. Williams tend to do well at that kind of thing, but even the last 2 Canadas, I don't really remember the races much. I remember qualifying. I remember being wet in 22 and possibly last year. But the races themselves, I don't really remember. But this is a circuit which in the past has produced several classic races. 07 and 2011 are the first ones that come to mind. Hopefully we can get back on track and things will be a bit. a bit more interesting. But the ingredients are there. It just hasn't happened.
Yeah, for sure. And I share your sentiments. Let's hope Montreal is a jolt to the system after what was a kind of a lackluster weekend in Monaco. So looking forward to that.
Yeah. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.